Can we stop the sixth mass extinction? Our planet has already lost thousands of plant and animal species, with projections to lose many more. As global warming and human encroachment dramatically change our landscape, are we at risk of killing the plants and animals we need to survive? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is mass extinction. Right now, more than 1 million species are in danger of extinction, disappearing at a rate not seen for 10 million years. And humans are mostly to blame. We have long understood how delicate our ecosystems are, yet still, our pollution and encroachment means we're losing both foundation species like corals and keystone species like bees, two key categories that could lead entire ecosystems to collapse. The United Nations is taking action in the form of a global biodiversity plan. While some governments have controversially asked farmers to modify how they farm to protect the environment. But is it enough to stop further extinction? Here's a look.
This instantly recognizable species lives in tropical South Asia, and it's not so far from extinction. There are only around 4,000 Bengal tigers left, down from 100,000 in 1900, but at least their numbers are stable. Red pandas, vaquita porpoises, Javan and Sumatran rhinos are some of the other large animals on the brink of extinction worldwide. And iconic species like the Yangtze pink river dolphins and the Tasmanian tiger have already gone forever. In fact, in the last 100 years, over 400 vertebrate species have been lost. And today, nearly 1 million species, both animal and plant, are under threat.
And then there are lots of species, individual species and habitats that are suffering so significantly that they'll go to extinction. Extinction is permanent, right? So at various scales, there are all kinds of irreversibly.
It's not the first time in our planet's history. Since plants began appearing on land around 500 million years ago, 5 great extinction events have changed the face of life on Earth. Scientists describe the current human-caused species loss as the 6th and fastest mass extinction. The United Nations University says that intense human activities, such as changes in land use, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, and the introduction of invasive species, are some of the reasons for the extinction acceleration. Scientists warn that biodiversity loss leads to unstable ecosystems, which in turn accelerates species extinction, and that puts humans under threat. It increases the threat of disease transmission, threatens food security, and potential medicine resources. In 1993, the United Nations designated May the 22nd as the International Day for Biological Diversity. But it wasn't until nearly 30 years later, in 2022, that nations finally adopted the so-called Biodiversity Plan. Under the agreement, they pledged to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. It also commits governments to a global target to conserve at least 30% of land, inland waters, and oceans worldwide.
We are acknowledging that protecting the natural world represents the sum of many efforts by governments, by businesses, and by us, each one of us as individuals and consumers. The new GBF is remarkable because we know our means of implementation now will be stronger, and it includes more financing on the table, especially for developing countries.
So, 2 years in and 6 years to go, how much progress is being made? There is pushback in the European Union from already cash-strapped farmers who are now being forced to comply with directives to put aside land for biodiversity. And do humans really care enough about biodiversity, or is the plan set to go the same way as the pledge to keep the world under 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming?
So just how crucial is it that biodiversity is protected, and can we avoid another mass extinction? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Ottawa, Special Advisor for Biodiversity to the Canadian government, Basile van Havre, From Uppsala, Sweden, assistant professor in biodiversity research at Uppsala University, Tobias Anderman. And in Plymouth, UK, co-founder of Wildcard, Joel Scott-Halkes. Thanks all so much for being with me. Joel, I'll start with you. I mean, how real a problem is the loss of biodiversity? Because, you know, among the general public, there doesn't seem to be a real sense of urgency compared, you know, to what we hear about global warming and the dangers of passing that 1.5 degrees, is there?
Well, to compare the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis as if they're two separate crises is already a problem. So the fact that we think that we can talk about the climate crisis and we can go to those COPs and have big international conferences as if we're going to fix it without sorting out our destruction of nature is a total fallacy. It's a total fantasy. And in some ways, the United Nations process that separates fixing biodiversity and fixing the climate into two parts is what has led to this artificial division. And as a result, to a certain degree, the sense in the public that climate is the big issue and we just need to focus on that. But the two things are inextricably linked. The destruction of nature has led to far more carbon going into the atmosphere. It's removed the ability of natural ecosystems, both on land and sea, to absorb carbon. And moreover, even if we were to artificially fix the climate crisis, say with artificial carbon drawdown, the collapse of the web of life, the loss of our wildlife, is a far greater existential threat. I think one of the reasons that we might be stumbling on this is that to deal with the biodiversity crisis is a much bigger philosophical ask. It requires us to realise that we as humans can't just fix everything mechanistically. We actually have to realise that we are just one species amongst many other. And that is a big ask for us to get down from our pedestals.
Yeah, in saying we are just one species among many others, it's asking really to kind of stop prioritizing, you know, our existence and our comforts and our way of life in order to address the biodiversity crisis, is it not?
Well, for me, actually, I think the possibility to dramatically change our impact on the planet and upscale human development and prosperity are actually totally possible together. So let's look at one of the key drivers of wildlife collapse, and that is our consumption of animal foods. Today, the technologies of alternative proteins, precision fermentation, cultivated meat, or just a general moral shift towards eating more plants and less animals, those are ways that we can be healthy, we can be well nourished, but dramatically downscale our land use. So I don't think they necessarily have to be in contradiction. We're not asking people to live in simpler conditions, to make big sacrifices. We just need to be smart about the direction in which we go, and we can achieve both things.
Let me turn to Basile quickly.
If I can.
Oh, go ahead, Basile.
Yes, okay, so I totally agree with what Joel said. We need to solve the three crises. Like there is no success if we succeed on one and not the others. And second, what we need to tell the global community and the global population is we're looking to a brighter future, a better one where we're going to have a more healthy life, where we're going to be freed of pandemics, or at least managing those risks a lot better. What we need is to make those transitions to get to that better world. So it's about how we describe and how we portray that different way of living with a different type of food, a fair and just development for those people that need it, and not trying to box them into conditions that are not optimal. We can do it, and we can do it in a way that's going to be a lot better for everyone, but it requires a lot of work and a lot of effort.
A lot of work by our leaders and by ourselves. But Basile, you know, part of the problem is in large part that many people just don't understand why losing species they've never even heard of really matters to them. So tell us, not least in economic terms, why people need to care, why the general public needs to care.
We have to realize, and those will be numbers I will quote that are not from me, but from people that are not necessarily tree huggers, like the World Economic Forum. More than half of our economy is depending on biodiversity. Whether you're growing food, whether you're growing timber, whether you're protecting a large city from weather events. So we have to realize that we totally depend, our life depends, and I heard Joel saying it a little bit earlier, on those biodiversity processes. They're not, yes, they're nice, and we all love to go on vacation and see wildlife, and we all need the access to nature for our mental health. But food on the table, shelter on our head, protection from severe weather events is depending on wildlife and from biological processes.
Let me turn to Tobias then. And, we now have a population that will be nearing 10 billion in our lifetime. So is it really possible to manage agricultural production that we need to feed ourselves with balancing protection of biodiversity? Can it really be done?
Yeah, that is, of course, a difficult question to answer, especially, as a scientist, that's not really technically my domain. But I think that what we see, or what we will need, is definitely an increase in efficiency of agriculture. And what we're seeing more when it comes to conservation measures, it's really like an area-based conservation plans where we set aside parts of the planet, parts of the terrestrial and aquatic area with biodiversity protection in mind. That does not necessarily mean that we cannot use it for other purposes as well, but it means that we prioritize biodiversity. And I think we need to maybe also shift our thinking a little bit from biodiversity protection, meaning giving up our quality of life. I think it's much more about sustaining our quality of life and actually improving it through making it sustainable for biodiversity, because it was already hinted at, but I think that's a very important point, that biodiversity is something we as people, we actually appreciate, that we need for our mental health and for our well-being. And I think we should look at it much more as our natural heritage that actually is an important part of our identity, rather than something we need to compromise to be able to keep.
But I really, Tobias, do you think it is possible to maintain a level of sustainability with a population coming to the size that it is coming to? Again, 10 billion in our lifetime, even more within the century. Technically, where we stand now, is it possible to continue to produce food and goods without compromising biodiversity?
I think it will be a challenge, for sure. That cannot be denied. I think it can, I think we can really improve the way we actually use the natural resources, that we plan more sustainable, that we don't just do clear cutting, burn and slash, certain practices that are known to neither be efficient nor good for biodiversity. So I think we can improve a lot through sort of intelligent measures of agriculture.
So you think it is possible? Joel, do you agree?
Well, I really comes down to what people are eating. That's if we really boil it down. So the global UN biodiversity framework recognizes that the biggest impact on wildlife, on biodiversity, is land use change. And that's a bit of a euphemistic term for saying we destroy habitats and we farm on it instead. And the biggest use of that farmland is eating meat, dairy, and other animal products. 80% of global farmland goes for the feed or the farming of animals. So the projections are that we're going to eat a huge lot more meat as the developed world starts to adopt the global north's very unhealthy diets. And if that carries on, the answer to your question is, yeah, we're completely screwed, ultimately. There just isn't the land to do it without devouring all remaining habitats. If, however, we can start to bend that curve, the global north can lead the way and start reducing its animal consumption dramatically, and the global south can start to develop in that direction as well, then it's possible. But it's not possible without diet change. That's ultimately what it comes.
But there are other issues, Joel. In non-meat and dairy farming, well, let me ask you this. Where are we seeing examples really of good leadership and initiatives in this space? Because we know it's been extremely controversial in Europe, where governments have demanded measures be taken on farms, dairy and otherwise, and the vegetables you're talking about and fruit. They're demanding these measures be taken to protect biodiversity, and a lot of farmers are furious that it's happening, and they're saying it's actually useless efforts. So what has to be done?
Well, in Europe, you've got a country that's sort of the microcosm of the whole thing, the Netherlands. in many ways, the Netherlands epitomizes what we need to do, which is to produce lots of food on a very small amount of land. And largely speaking, when it comes to their horticulture, the production of fruits and vegetables and other plant products, that's going very well, and their arable farming as well. When it comes to their dairy farming in particular, that's where we were leading to this massive river pollution, massive nitrogen pollution, which is a great issue. Now, for the farmer protests in Europe, it's easy for us to think it's all about pushback on the environment. If you actually go and speak to farmers, they care about biodiversity, they care about wildlife. They're not heartless people who hate these things. They just need to be paid properly for it. At the moment, they're being squeezed by international trade deals that have gone wrong, by falling supermarket prices, a whole host of other squeezes like fuel prices, and then they're being told, here's a whole load of extra things you've got to do. Understandably, they're pushing back. But if that was met with proper money, if the subsidies, such as the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe, were redirected really well and properly funded, farmers are not going to say no to a good pay deal to do good things for nature.
Okay.
I could not agree. I could not agree more with what Joel said. Farmers need to be at the center of the design of the solution, and farmers want to do the right thing. So it is about changing the financial system and the financial incentive, and then sitting down with farmers and designing a solution that work with them and work with the consumers. I'm convinced this can be done, and that's one of the biggest change. When we agreed to the global biodiversity frameworks in Montreal a year and a half ago, we knew that this was the number one change that needed to happen, and would be the most difficult one.
And, you know, it's not just about farming, Basile. I mean, even though Joel insists that is the biggest single component. But do you have any opinion, really, then, on what kind of incentives or punitive measures could be offered to major corporate polluters, particularly extraction, to protect biodiversity in that realm as well?
One of the big tool that we're going to have is that Target 18, which is on reducing negative incentives and subsidies. This is a massive job. This is a difficult one. If you talk to the people that have been working on that on the climate change side, they're really pointing to the enormity of the job. But if we can stop those incentives, if we can stop those the subsidies on biodiversity negative activities, then we get a really, really good chance to let the market work. What I'm seeing is, in many parts of the world, there is a start of having system that mandate some offsets. So each time you're taking a plot of land, you gotta restore another of equal size or even better, bigger part. So we're moving into a different system. I think it's about harnessing the power of the market to make it happen.
Tobias, let me ask you something. I mean, in researching biodiversity, give us some kind of more detailed examples of which areas really worry you the most. Where are you seeing the most rapid kind of deterioration of biodiversity that's going to have a more massive effect?
Yeah, I think there are areas, especially around the equator areas, that are incredibly species rich and that are also disappearing at the fastest pace. I mean, the famous examples of the rainforest in South America, the Amazon. But I think what's actually even more worrying is that we don't know so much about biodiversity. There are still such huge gaps in our understanding of biodiversity and its distribution that we actually need to fill before we can make really, really smart decisions in terms of which areas to prioritize. And I think that's where at least the research community really, really needs to put a lot of work in the next years to tackle these huge data gaps that we have. And this is data gaps in terms of regions that are not very well understood in terms of their biodiversity, but also data gaps in terms of groups of organisms that have been hardly surveyed, that we hardly have any idea about the distribution.
Give us a quick example, Tobias. Like, where are these massive data gaps? Which areas are not being studied that you're really concerned about?
So there's a huge bias in biodiversity data that most of our biodiversity data is from Europe, North America, and then some, patches of places where a lot of field work has been done. But if you look at the global distribution of data, there are still the biggest gaps are actually in the places with the biggest biodiversity. So that those are the most important hotspots, potentially also the areas where we have most of the uncatalogued, ununderstood biodiversity present.
Okay. Joel, let me come back to you because, some argue, as we were mentioning, developing countries, some argue that they are paying, a higher price to protect the environment. And then you have leaders like former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who definitely agrees with that. I mean, he allowed for greater deforestation of the Amazon rainforest in defense of the economy. So what are your concerns on the political front? If we see more leaders like him coming to power, which is quite possible, can any of these plans that we have to bring biodiversity back, can they actually work?
Yes, well, from the developing world's point of view, it's easy to see why there is extreme outrage. One could compare the United Kingdom, where our best data is that we have at most 5% of our landmass adequately protected for nature, just 5%. Compare that to Guyana, 91% forest. Now, obviously, different bits of the world have got different habitats they're protecting, but ultimately, unless the global north starts actually acting and making major dramatic action, so in the UK, for example, that means that between now and 2030, we've got to protect another 25% of the landmass to reach the Kunming-Montreal Protocol. I mean, that's historic. It's huge. It would require a mobilization of the economy bigger than a mobilization for a world war. It would require a total transformation. So we're going to fall short of that. And unless we try our very best, then yes, I absolutely do see that political risk in the global south. It's justifiable anger, but unfortunately, the reality of the situation is we also can't cave into that otherwise because there's just so little left as well.
And I mean, Joel, how are those political failures going to manifest for the world? I mean, when we mentioned in the introduction these keystone species, for example. I mean, everyone's familiar with bees and that there's an issue there. But what is really going to change? In places like the Amazon rainforest, if we don't have the political will to protect those areas, for the global population, what are they not going to see on their plates? What are they not going to be? How is it going to affect their home life, their pocketbooks?
I think, curiously, actually, it's a bit difficult to simplify the narrative that if we destroy a whole load of other ecosystems, it's suddenly going to impact you if you eat a standard Western diet. A lot of our diet has been simplified to the degree that actually huge amounts of that Western diet is not massively exposed directly, say, to the destruction of the Amazon. What you're going to see instead, though, is the cumulative effect, say, of climate tipping points. So if we lose the Amazon to a proper tipping point where it starts to burn over and become savanna, that is going to massively impact the climate, massively going to impact on extreme weather events throughout the rest of the world. But to me, it's almost partly the way that these framings, it's not, I've been on similar news shows like this before. We're still all asking this question from our own point of view, which is partly understandable. But I would always offer up the thought experiment that if an alien species landed here and asked the human race to justify why it shouldn't be made extinct, we might not want to put it in instrumental terms. We might not want to say to them, well, we can offer you really nice things to eat as part of your dinner, and if you get rid of us, they won't be there. We'd probably want to say we have inherent value, and it's a really nice thing that humans exist. So I would put that to those beautiful habitats that still exist. They are Renaissance paintings of complexity, and you can't just go, well, they're not very useful, so let's slash them there.
Interesting analysis. Thanks, Joel. Let me ask Basile, though. Actually, final question, I think, because you're going to be attending COP16 on biodiversity later in the fall. To see how far the new plans to protect our global biodiversity will actually take us. What kind of expectations do you have?
That's a very big question. First, I would say what I've seen over the last year and a half is an unprecedented level of activities. So I am amazed to see around the world, everywhere, how people have been working hard, updating their plans, putting action. Is that going to be enough? Are we going to be reaching the targets we set ourselves 2 years ago? I don't know. And I think there is going to be some interesting discussion. Now, we can we can just go as fast as the process will let us go. Like when we are talking about protected area, and then you're dealing in the countries where there is indigenous and local communities,
Right.
you cannot force that. You cannot force that on them, and then engaging them in a meaningful way take time. So let's have a good conversation. Let's see where we are. Let's see how we can help each other, and
Will that be
share the
enough to
load.
stop the 6th mass extinction?
That's the part I don't know, and that's where people like Tobias will be important to tell us how we're making progress and
Tobias?
how those systems will do.
Yeah, let me ask Tobias then quickly in our last 20 seconds. Are you confident in humanity to stop this from coming?
I am confident that we can turn the trend around. We will lose things along the way. I mean, we will lose more species certainly in the process, but I think at the end, the direction is important, that we will be on a positive, biodiversity positive trend, and I think that's achievable.
Good to hear that. Tobias, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.